In the winter of 1942, the snow falls thick over East Prussia, blanketing the wolf's lair in silence. Inside the reinforced concrete bunker complex, Adolf Hitler stands before a map table, his hands trembling not from age but from rage barely contained. It's 11:30 p.m. and the Führer hasn't slept in 2 days. The reports arriving from Army Group South contradict everything his intelligence chiefs promised him. Everything. For months, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence, assured Hitler that Soviet forces were collapsing, that Stalin's armies were weeks from total annihilation. Reinhard Jahlen's Foreign Armies East briefings painted a picture of a broken enemy, scattered divisions, depleted reserves. The numbers looked good. The projections looked better. And Hitler, hungry for validation of his strategic genius, believed every word. But tonight, in the dim light of the map room, reality has arrived in the form of casualty reports, intercepted radio transmissions, and frantic field communications from General Friedrich Paulus at Stalingrad. The Red Army isn't collapsing, it's counterattacking, and it's winning. This is the moment when the most powerful man in Europe realizes he's been fighting a phantom war, one constructed from fabricated intelligence, wishful thinking, and the terrified lies of officers too afraid to tell their Führer the truth. What happens in the next 72 hours will determine the fate of millions and expose the fatal flaw at the heart of Nazi Germany's war machine. A leader who demanded only good news and subordinates who learned to manufacture it. By the end of this story, you'll understand how Hitler's own system destroyed him from within, and how the Eastern Front became not just a military disaster, but an intelligence catastrophe of historic proportions. The official narrative, the one fed to the German public through Goebbels' propaganda machine, painted a picture of inevitable triumph on the Eastern Front. Newsreels showed endless columns of Soviet prisoners, burning tanks, captured cities. Radio broadcasts declared the Bolshevik threat neutralized. In Berlin's cafes and Munich's beer halls, citizens spoke confidently of victory by Christmas, of 1941, then 1942, and now somehow 1943. But inside the Führer's headquarters, a different story was unfolding. One whispered in hallways and buried in classified reports. The Wehrmacht's intelligence apparatus, split between the Abwehr under Canaris, the SS Intelligence Service under Walter Schellenberg, and Foreign Armies East under Colonel Reinhard Jahlen, had created a system where truth was fungible, where data was shaped to match ideology. Jahlen, a career officer with ambitions for advancement, had mastered the art of intelligence that pleased. His assessments consistently underestimated Soviet production capacity, troop reserves, and strategic depth. When reconnaissance indicated new Soviet tank factories beyond the Urals, Jahlen's reports minimized their significance. When signals intelligence revealed massive troop movements, he characterized them as defensive redeployments. Hitler wanted to hear that one more offensive would break the Soviets, and Jahlen's briefings always provided just enough evidence to justify one more push. Canaris, the enigmatic admiral who would later be implicated in resistance activities, operated differently but with similar results. The Abwehr's agents in Moscow were either compromised, fictional, or feeding information that Soviet intelligence wanted Germany to receive. The intelligence picture Canaris presented wasn't deliberately falsified. It was simply incomplete, filtered through sources that no longer existed or had been turned. The reality, known to frontline commanders but never clearly communicated upward, was catastrophic. By November 1942, Army Group B was overextended across 500 miles of steppe, its flanks held by Romanian and Italian divisions equipped with weapons from the previous war. Soviet intelligence, under the direction of Stalin's ruthless apparatus, had concealed the buildup of over 1 million fresh troops, 1,300 aircraft, and nearly 1,000 tanks north and south of Stalingrad. Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive, wasn't a desperate gamble. It was a carefully orchestrated hammer blow aimed at Germany's weakest point. And Hitler's intelligence services had missed it entirely. More accurately, they had reported fragments of it, but those fragments were dismissed, downplayed, or simply ignored because they contradicted the Führer's conviction that the Soviets were finished. This wasn't just bad intelligence. This was systematic self-deception, where the entire apparatus of Nazi military intelligence had learned that accuracy was less important than palatability. Officers who reported setbacks were relieved. Those who promised breakthroughs were promoted. The incentive structure guaranteed that Hitler would never hear the truth, until reality itself arrived in the form of T-34 tanks smashing through Romanian lines at dawn on November 19, 1942. To understand how this intelligence catastrophe unfolded, you must understand the man at its center. Adolf Hitler in 1942 was not the frantic, broken figure of his final bunker days. He was still vigorous, still commanding, still capable of the hypnotic intensity that had brought him to power. But he was also something else, a strategic amateur who had convinced himself he was a military genius. Hitler's early successes in Poland, France, and the Balkans had been achieved through boldness, superior tactics, and critically excellent intelligence. The Blitzkrieg victories weren't just about tanks and aircraft, they were about knowing where the enemy was weak and striking there. But as the war expanded, Hitler increasingly substituted his intuition for professional military judgment. After dismissing multiple generals during the winter crisis of 1941, he assumed personal command of the Wehrmacht, making him simultaneously head of state, supreme commander, and de facto field commander. This concentration of power created an impossible situation for his intelligence chiefs. Men like Jalin and Canaris weren't just analyzing enemy capabilities, they were managing Hitler's expectations, his temper, and his belief system. Jalin, a slim, bespectacled officer with a gift for presentation, understood that his role was political as much as analytical. He would later describe his work during this period as anticipating what the Führer needed to hear to make correct decisions, a Kafkaesque formulation that revealed everything about the system's dysfunction. Wilhelm Canaris, the Abwehr chief, was a more complex figure. A career naval officer, he had served with distinction in World War I and possessed genuine intelligence experience. But by 1942, Canaris had become disillusioned with the Nazi regime. His agency harbored numerous officers who would later be connected to resistance activities. Yet publicly, Canaris maintained the facade, delivering intelligence that supported operational plans even when he privately doubted them. His subordinates noticed his careful language, his hedged assessments, his way of presenting bad news with bureaucratic distance. The third figure in this intelligence triangle was Reinhard Heydrich's successor at the SS intelligence apparatus, Walter Schellenberg. Though Heydrich's assassination in June 1942 had disrupted SS intelligence operations, Schellenberg, younger and more ruthless than Canaris, operated the SD's foreign intelligence section with an eye toward supplanting the Abwehr entirely. The rivalry between these agencies meant that intelligence was often withheld, manipulated, or selectively shared based on bureaucratic advantage rather than military necessity. Hitler's relationship with these men was transactional and paranoid. He trusted no one completely but demanded absolute confidence in their reports. He would interrogate minor details, challenge assumptions, and then, if the conclusions suited his strategic vision, accept the entire assessment without further scrutiny. Generals noted that briefings became performances, where tone and confidence mattered more than data. This wasn't megalomania in the conventional sense. Hitler genuinely believed he possessed strategic insight that professional officers lacked. His study of military history, though largely self-taught and selective, convinced him that bold leaders who ignored cautious advisors achieved greatness. Napoleon, Frederick the Great, these were his models. What he failed to recognize was that both men had reliable intelligence systems and knew when to retreat. By late 1942, Hitler had surrounded himself with officers who had learned to speak his language, to frame intelligence in terms of will and determination rather than logistics and mathematics. When Jalin reported Soviet industrial production, he did so in terms that minimized its strategic impact. When Canaris reported on partisan activity behind German lines, he characterized it as manageable rather than operationally significant. The result was a Führer who believed his own propaganda, commanding armies based on intelligence that was less analysis than institutional flattery. The warning signs began in October 1942, but they arrived fragmented and underemphasized. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights over the Don River Bend reported concentrations of Soviet troops, but these were characterized as defensive positions. Radio intercepts suggested major troop movements, but German signals intelligence had become less effective as Soviet communications security improved. On October 29, Colonel Jalin delivered his regular assessment to Hitler at the Wolf's Lair. The briefing, attended by Field Marshal Wilhelm Kadel and Colonel General Alfred Jodl, painted a picture of Soviet weakness. Jalin estimated total Soviet reserves at barely 1 million men across the entire front, a figure that would prove to be off by a factor of 3. More critically, he assessed that the Red Army lacked the capability for major offensive operations before spring 1943. Hitler listened, asked pointed questions about Soviet tank production, his obsession, and accepted Jalin's reassurances. The Führer was focused on Stalingrad, convinced that its capture would break Soviet morale and secure the Caucasus oil fields. Everything else was secondary. But at Army Group B headquarters, commanded by General Maximilian von Weichs, a different picture was emerging. Intelligence officers were receiving reports from Romanian units on the northern flank, increased Soviet activity, probing attacks, movement of armor. Von Weichs forwarded these concerns through proper channels, but they were filtered through the lens of institutional optimism before reaching Hitler. General Paulus, commanding the 6th Army inside Stalingrad, was too focused on house-to-house fighting to appreciate the strategic vulnerability of his position. His intelligence chief, Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Adam, noted Soviet buildup but assessed it as reinforcement for the Stalingrad garrison, not preparation for a counteroffensive. The critical intelligence failure was one of imagination. German commanders, schooled in Western Front tactics from World War I and Blitzkrieg operations in Europe, couldn't conceive that the Soviets would attempt a double envelopment across hundreds of miles of open steppe using forces that didn't appear on German order of battle estimates. The scale was unprecedented. The deception was masterful. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, architect of the counteroffensive, had learned from earlier disasters. Operation Uranus was planned in absolute secrecy. Troop movements occurred at night. Radio silence was enforced. Deception operations suggested attacks elsewhere. German intelligence, starved of reliable human sources after 2 years of brutal occupation, had no way to penetrate Soviet planning. On November 12th, a Romanian patrol captured a Soviet officer carrying operational orders. The documents revealed planning for a major attack, but they were dismissed at higher headquarters as either disinformation or limited in scope. This was the last clear warning Hitler's intelligence apparatus would provide before the storm broke. By November 18th, as temperatures plummeted and snow began falling across the steppe, the stage was set. Hitler remained in East Prussia, confident that Stalingrad would fall within days. Jalin's latest assessment, delivered that morning, maintained that Soviet forces north and south of the city were incapable of coordinated action. At 7:30 a.m. on November 19, 1942, 3,500 Soviet guns opened fire on Romanian positions north of Stalingrad. The snow was so thick that German observers couldn't see the attack coming. Within hours, Romanian divisions were collapsing. By evening, Soviet tank corps had punched through and were racing south toward the Don crossings. The intelligence catastrophe was complete, and Hitler was about to discover just how thoroughly his spies had failed him. The first reports reached the Wolf's Lair at approximately 2:15 p.m. on November 19th. They were fragmentary, transmitted through panicked radio operators. Heavy Soviet attack, Romanian 3rd Army sector, situation unclear. Within hours, the situation became devastatingly clear. The Romanians weren't holding, they were disintegrating. Hitler received the initial briefing from Jodl at 6:00 p.m. The Führer's response was characteristic. He ordered an immediate counterattack, dismissed the Soviet breakthrough as a local affair, and demanded that Paulus continue offensive operations inside Stalingrad. There was no acknowledgement that the intelligence had been catastrophically wrong, no question about how a Soviet force of this magnitude had been missed. But by midnight, as reports flooded in from Army Group B, the scale became undeniable. Soviet forces had penetrated 50 miles in some sectors. A second hammer blow struck south of Stalingrad at dawn on November 20th, shattering Romanian and German positions. By evening of the 21st, Soviet pincers were 40 miles from meeting, which would trap Paulus's entire 6th Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army inside Stalingrad. This was the moment. November 21st, 1942, at approximately 11:00 p.m., Hitler gathered his senior staff in the map room. Present were Kadel, Jodl, Jalin, and several Wehrmacht operations officers. The atmosphere was suffocating. Hitler's hands moved across the map, his fingers tracing the Romanian collapse, the Soviet advance, the closing pocket. According to multiple accounts from officers present, documented in post-war testimonies, Hitler spoke in a low, controlled voice that was more frightening than his famous rages. "Where did they come from?" he asked Jalin. "How many divisions, how many tanks?" Jalin attempted to explain: reserves from Siberia, redeployed forces from quieter sectors, mobilization beyond previous estimates. Each explanation sounded weaker than the last. Hitler interrupted. "For 2 months you told me the Soviets were finished. You showed me charts, numbers, assessments. Were they all lies?" The word hung in the air, not mistakes, not errors, lies. Jalin reportedly stammered through a response about the difficulty of intelligence gathering, about Soviet deception, about the fog of war. Hitler cut him off and turned to the map. For several minutes no one spoke. Then the Führer made his decision. The 6th Army would not retreat. Paulus would hold Stalingrad and await relief from outside. This decision, catastrophic in its own right, flowed directly from the intelligence failure. Because Hitler had been assured for months that Soviet reserves were depleted, he believed a relief operation could succeed. Because Jalin's assessments had consistently underestimated Soviet capabilities, Hitler thought the encirclement could be broken. The lies had created a strategic fantasy, and Hitler was about to sacrifice 300,000 men to maintain it. Over the next 72 hours, as the Soviet pincers closed at Kalach-on-the-Don on November 23rd, Hitler received more accurate intelligence. But by then his worldview had fractured. He alternated between denying the severity of the situation and blaming his intelligence services for misleading him. In a conversation with General Kurt Zeitzler recorded in Wehrmacht logs, Hitler declared, "I have been surrounded by defeatists and liars. They told me what they thought I wanted to hear, and now we face disaster." It was a rare moment of clarity, but it came too late, and Hitler failed to recognize his own role in creating the system that produced those lies. The immediate fallout was military catastrophe. By December 1942, over 250,000 German and Axis troops were encircled at Stalingrad. Hermann Göring's promise that the Luftwaffe could supply the pocket by air proved as illusory as Jaelen's intelligence, another lie based on optimism rather than logistics. But the intelligence ramifications extended beyond Stalingrad. Hitler's faith in his military intelligence apparatus was shattered. In the months following the encirclement, he increasingly bypassed formal intelligence channels, relying instead on his instincts and ad hoc reports from SS sources. Canaris found himself marginalized, his Abwehr viewed with suspicion. Jaelen remained in position, there was no one to replace him, but his assessments were now met with skepticism and rage. The SS, sensing opportunity, expanded its intelligence operations under Heinrich Himmler's direction. The rivalry between the Abwehr and SS intelligence intensified, leading to further fragmentation of Germany's intelligence picture. By 1944, when Canaris was arrested for alleged involvement in the July 20th plot against Hitler, the Abwehr was folded into the SS entirely, ensuring that military intelligence became fully subordinate to ideological considerations. At the strategic level, the Eastern Front intelligence failure had cascading effects. German operations for the remainder of the war were planned with increasing detachment from reality. Operation Citadel, the summer 1943 offensive at Kursk, was launched despite intelligence indicating that the Soviets had prepared massive defenses, but Hitler, no longer trusting his intelligence services, chose to believe the offensive would succeed through willpower. For the Soviet Union, the intelligence victory at Stalingrad was as significant as the military one. Soviet maskirovka, deception, had proven devastatingly effective against German intelligence. Stalin's NKVD, which ran extensive deception operations, had successfully concealed the true scale of Soviet military recovery. This success emboldened Soviet intelligence to run increasingly ambitious operations, including the Trust operation that fed false information through captured German agents. Individual careers were destroyed. Jaelen survived the war and was recruited by the Americans, eventually heading West German intelligence during the Cold War, a rehabilitation that speaks to the pragmatism of intelligence work. Canaris was executed in April 1945. Numerous Abwehr officers were purged, arrested, or transferred. But perhaps the most significant consequence was psychological. Hitler's realization that his intelligence services had lied, or at minimum had been catastrophically wrong, destroyed his ability to trust information that contradicted his preconceptions. For the remainder of the war, he operated increasingly in a fantasy world where non-existent divisions were ordered into battle, where miracle weapons would reverse Germany's fortunes, where willpower could substitute for military reality. The system that had taught subordinates to tell Hitler what he wanted to hear now made it impossible for him to hear the truth even when officers tried to deliver it. Generals who warned of impending disaster were dismissed as defeatists. Intelligence that suggested Allied strength was rejected as enemy propaganda. The intelligence failure at Stalingrad didn't just cost Germany an army. It cost Hitler his connection to reality, and with it, any chance of rational strategic decision-making for the remainder of World War II. Stalingrad itself became the graveyard of not just men but illusions. On February 2, 1943, Field Marshal Paulus, promoted by Hitler in a last symbolic gesture, surrendered the remaining forces. Of the 300,000 men encircled, fewer than 6,000 would eventually return to Germany. The intelligence services scrambled to reorganize. Jaelen remarkably retained his position and attempted to rebuild Foreign Armies East's credibility through more conservative assessments. But the damage was permanent. Hitler's daily briefings became exercises in mutual distrust, where every estimate was challenged and every setback blamed on sabotage or incompetence. By mid-1943, a new pattern emerged. Hitler would demand intelligence that supported his operational plans, and when that intelligence proved false, he would blame the messengers while proceeding with the operations anyway. This happened at Kursk, where intelligence clearly indicated Soviet preparation, yet the offensive proceeded. It happened during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, where optimistic intelligence about Allied weakness contributed to Germany's last major offensive, which ended in another disaster. Canaris's fall was gradual but inevitable. His arrest in July 1944, following the attempted assassination of Hitler, revealed the extent to which the Abwehr had been penetrated by resistance elements. Documents recovered from Canaris's safe included evidence of contacts with foreign powers and knowledge of plots against the Führer. He was hanged at Flossenburg concentration camp on April 9, 1945, weeks before Germany's surrender. The consolidation of intelligence under SS control, completed by early 1944, ensured that military intelligence became inseparable from ideological enforcement. Reports were filtered through the lens of Nazi racial theory and strategic fantasy. Intelligence that suggested Germany was losing the war was suppressed or reinterpreted as temporary setbacks that would be reversed through fanatical resistance. For the Allies, German intelligence failures became exploitable vulnerabilities. British and American deception operations, including the elaborate schemes around D-Day, succeeded in part because German intelligence had lost the ability to distinguish truth from fantasy. The Abwehr agents in Britain had been captured and turned, feeding false information that was believed because it matched German preconceptions. The final accounting is grim. Germany's intelligence catastrophe on the Eastern Front in 1942 set in motion a cascade of failures that contributed directly to the Nazi regime's total defeat. What began with optimistic assessments from officers afraid to disappoint their Führer ended with an intelligence apparatus so compromised, so politicized, and so divorced from reality that it became worse than useless. It became actively harmful to German military operations. The lessons were studied intensively after the war by intelligence services worldwide. The danger of intelligence to please, the necessity of independent analysis, the catastrophic consequences of subordinating intelligence to ideology. The CIA's founding charter included provisions specifically designed to prevent American intelligence from becoming what German intelligence had become under Hitler, a propaganda service disguised as analysis. But in February 1943, as the survivors of Stalingrad marched into Soviet captivity, those lessons were still to be learned. What remained was the wreckage of an intelligence system that had lied to itself for so long that it could no longer recognize truth, even when it arrived in the form of Soviet tanks. There is a photograph from the Wolf's Lair, taken in early 1943 shortly after Stalingrad's fall. Hitler stands over the map table, his generals arrayed around him, their faces carefully neutral. What the photograph doesn't capture is the invisible barrier that had descended between the Führer and reality, a barrier constructed from lies, wishful thinking, and institutional cowardice. Intelligence at its core is the art of telling difficult truths to powerful people. It requires courage from analysts and humility from leaders. What Hitler created was the opposite, a system where power punished truth and rewarded comforting fiction. The spies didn't lie because they were traitors, they lied because honesty had become professionally suicidal. This is the eternal lesson of the Eastern Front intelligence catastrophe. When leaders surround themselves with people who tell them only what they want to hear, they don't just lose access to truth, they lose the ability to recognize it when it appears. Hitler's rage in November 1942 wasn't the anger of a man betrayed by subordinates. It was the fury of someone confronting the consequences of his own system. The moment Hitler realized his spies had lied wasn't a moment of betrayal, it was a moment of recognition. He had built a machine designed to deceive him, staffed it with people whose survival depended on successful deception, and then acted surprised when the machine delivered lies. In the end, the Eastern Front wasn't lost because of Soviet strength or German weakness. It was lost because one man demanded certainty in an uncertain world, and an entire intelligence apparatus bent itself to provide that certainty, until reality, indifferent to reports and briefings and confident assessments, arrived with the sound of Soviet artillery in the snow. The question history asks is not whether Hitler's spies lied. It's whether in that system they ever had the chance to tell the truth.